The fall of a Southern dynasty. The Murdaugh murders. For more than a century, one name ruled South Carolina's Lowcountry. The Murdaughs were not just a family, they were the law itself. Generations of prosecutors, power, and privilege, all built on the same Southern soil. But in the summer of 2021, that legacy cracked open. A mother and son found murdered on the family's vast estate. A father once untouchable, now the prime suspect in a crime that stunned the nation. As secrets surfaced and bodies fell, a dynasty built on justice faced its own verdict. This is not just the story of a murder. It's the story of how power consumes itself. For more than a century, the name Murdaugh carried weight across the quiet marshlands of South Carolina's Lowcountry. It was a name woven into the very fabric of Hampton County, printed on courthouse plaques, carved into the walls of law offices, whispered with both respect and resentment. 3 generations of Murdaugh men had served as the region's prosecutors, known locally as solicitors, their authority stretching across 5 counties. They were not just lawyers, they were the law itself. If you were accused of a crime, defended in court, or hoping for a favor in Hampton County, chances were a Murdaugh stood somewhere in that chain of influence. Alex Murdaugh grew up inside that world of inherited privilege and unspoken power. He followed the family script precisely, studying law, joining the family's prestigious firm, PMPED, and defending clients who trusted the Murdaugh name more than the justice system itself. He lived on a sprawling estate called Moselle, 1,700 acres of southern wilderness, split by the Salkehatchie River, where cypress trees dripped with Spanish moss, and the family hunted ducks, deer, and respectability. To outsiders, the Murdaughs seemed unshakable, wealthy, charitable, untouchable. But within that carefully kept image, the cracks had already begun to spread. By 2019, those cracks widened into something darker. Alex's younger son, Paul Murdaugh, then 20, was charged in connection with a deadly boating crash that killed Mallory Beach, a 19-year-old local girl. Witnesses said Paul had been drinking heavily. The crash happened at nearly 2 a.m. when the boat slammed into a bridge piling. The tragedy tore through the community and turned the Murdaugh name, once a shield, into a target. Lawsuits followed, the press circled, and whispers began that the family's power was finally running out. Behind the scenes, Alex's finances were collapsing under the weight of secret loans, unpaid debts, and years of quiet theft from his own clients. Still, to anyone driving past the iron gates of Moselle, nothing looked unusual. The dogs barked, the fields glowed gold in the late light, and Alex's wife Maggie kept posting smiling family photos online. The illusion of Southern stability held firm until one summer night in 2021, when the dynasty's silence was broken by gunfire. What happened next would not only destroy a family, but unravel a century-old empire that had ruled its corner of South Carolina like a private kingdom. Behind the stately facade of the Murdaugh name, daily life had begun to feel like a careful performance. Lawsuits from the 2019 boat crash were not just a reputational hit, they were a financial accelerant on a fire already smoldering. Inside PMPED, the family's law firm, accountants flagged irregularities that didn't look like simple errors. Settlement checks passed briefly through accounts that should never have touched client money. Disbursements took detours. What looked at first glance like administrative confusion began to resemble design. Alex Murdaugh responded to mounting pressure in the way powerful men often do when the ground starts to give. He tried to stand even taller. He kept the hunting trips on schedule, kept the family photos bright, kept the talk in small-town rooms warm and familiar. Yet the numbers were unrelenting. Personal loans, lines of credit, debts obscured by the vagaries of law firm accounting. These were not burdens that could be charmed away. The lawsuits tied to the boat crash threatened discovery into his finances, and discovery threatened exposure. 1,000 small decisions, each made to paper over the last, were converging on a single point in time. On the surface, nothing had changed. Beneath it, everything was ready to break. June 7th, 2021, a humid summer evening in South Carolina. On the sprawling grounds of the Murdaugh family's Moselle estate, the woods were alive with the sounds of crickets and hounds. At 10:07 p.m., the Colleton County Dispatch Center received a frantic 911 call. On the line was Alex Murdaugh, his voice trembling, gasping between sobs. "It's bad. It's very bad. My wife and son have been shot badly." When officers arrived, they followed the beam of their flashlights down a dirt path leading to the dog kennels, a structure Alex's sons had used for their hunting dogs since childhood. What they found there would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Maggie Murdaugh, 52, lay face down in the dirt, shot multiple times with a rifle. Nearby, her son Paul, only 22, had been hit at close range with a shotgun. The scene was chaotic, yet strangely quiet. 2 different guns, 2 victims, 1 husband waiting at the gate. Alex told investigators he had been visiting his elderly mother at another property when the murders occurred. He said he came home to find their bodies, immediately called 911, and never touched anything. But his calmness and precision struck officers as unnatural, almost rehearsed. Later, when detectives reviewed data from his phone and car, inconsistencies appeared. His car had left Moselle later than he claimed. His phone showed little movement during the critical window. And most importantly, a video taken by Paul on his phone minutes before his death, capturing the sound of the dogs barking, contained Alex's voice in the background. In that single piece of evidence, the timeline collapsed. Alex had said he wasn't there, but Paul's phone proved he was. The autopsies later confirmed that Maggie and Paul had been shot around 8:50 p.m., nearly an hour before Alex's emergency call. Blood patterns, shell casings, and footprints linked to the property suggested no outside intruder. The only remaining question was why. For investigators, the case now had a chilling symmetry. The family that had once prosecuted hundreds of crimes in this very region was now the subject of its most notorious murder investigation. Journalists descended on Hampton County. Helicopters hovered above the estate, and for the first time, the Murdaugh gates were no longer symbols of power, but of suspicion. In the months following the murders of Maggie and Paul, South Carolina's Lowcountry began to change. The familiar name Murdaugh, once associated with justice, charity, and respect, now lingered in the air with unease. Reporters who once covered ribbon cuttings were now camped outside courthouses. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles. The unthinkable had happened. The most powerful family in Hampton County had become its darkest scandal. At first, investigators handled Alex Murdaugh cautiously. He was still a lawyer, still connected, still part of the legal machinery that had run the region for decades. But as weeks passed, cracks in his story deepened. Financial records from his firm, PMPED, began to reveal a troubling pattern. Money had been quietly vanishing from client accounts for years. Alex had been funneling settlement funds, insurance payments, even death claims into personal accounts and shell companies to maintain his extravagant lifestyle. The lawman had been stealing from the law itself. The discovery forced PMPED to push him out of the firm. Within days, Alex's empire, built on influence and fear, began to collapse. The same week, the Beach family's civil case against him gained traction, threatening to expose the depth of his financial crimes. He was cornered, and for the first time in his life, the Murdaugh name couldn't save him. When PMPED finally confronted the irregularities, the shape of the scheme came into focus. Alex had been routing money to a bank account he'd set up under a name meant to mimic a legitimate vendor. Forge, the kind of title that, on an internal ledger, didn't raise alarms. To a bookkeeper moving quickly through a busy practice, Forge looked like an expert consultant or structured settlement intermediary. In reality, it was a financial cul-de-sac. Funds went in and never returned to the clients they were meant to compensate. Former clients testified later that they trusted Alex because everyone trusted Alex. One widow described waiting for a settlement check that kept being recalculated. Another recalled signing forms she didn't fully understand because she believed the firm was a family and the family was the town. In court, those voices carried a different kind of weight than the forensic accountants. They were reminders that theft, when practiced by a professional, is not only arithmetic, it is betrayal with letterhead. Within the firm, shock turned into triage. Partners traced transactions, notified carriers, and prepared for the public reckoning they knew was coming. The image of the Murdaughs as guardians of the legal order could not coexist with the spreadsheets on their screens. Outside the firm, the Beach family's civil case, already a regional headline, now appeared to be the loose thread that might unravel the rest. The more attorneys pulled, the more fabric came away in their hands. Then came a twist that stunned even those who had followed the case closely. On September 4th, 2021, Alex called police again, this time claiming he'd been shot on a lonely rural road while changing a tire. The bullet had grazed his head, and he survived. Within days, investigators discovered the truth. Alex had hired a man named Curtis Edward Smith, a distant acquaintance, to shoot him. The plan, he admitted, was to make his own death look like a murder so that his surviving son, Buster, could collect a $10 million life insurance payout. The once respected attorney had tried to stage his own assassination. What followed was a cascade of revelations. Authorities charged him with insurance fraud, conspiracy, and filing false police reports. The illusion of the dignified Southern lawyer shattered completely. And that illusion kept unraveling because investigators were still digging into the death of Gloria Satterfield, the family's longtime housekeeper, who had died in a fall at Moselle in 2018. At the time, Alex told her sons they would be compensated through his insurance, then secretly redirected the settlement money, more than $4 million, to his own accounts. He had stolen even from the family of a woman who'd served him for decades. With every new indictment, the portrait of Alex Murdaugh grew darker. He confessed to years of opioid addiction and admitted to stealing millions. More than 100 separate criminal charges were filed against him for fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. His reputation in Hampton County was gone, replaced by disbelief. How had no one seen it sooner? How could a man who had controlled the justice system for generations manipulate it so easily for himself? By late 2022, investigators had enough to connect the murders of Maggie and Paul to Alex's financial ruin. Prosecutors argued that he killed them to gain sympathy, to distract from his impending exposure and to buy time before his thefts were uncovered. To them, the murders were not crimes of passion. They were the final desperate act of a man watching his empire collapse. In July 2022, Alex Murdaugh was arrested and formally charged with the murders of his wife and son. The arrest was a turning point for the entire Lowcountry. The man whose family had built its power on the courthouse steps was now being led up those same steps in handcuffs. For residents who had once whispered the Murdaugh name with reverence, it felt as though history itself had flipped. The trial began in January 2023, drawing international attention. Television cameras captured every frame, Alex sitting rigid in the courtroom, lawyers pacing before jurors, and witnesses describing a web of lies so tangled it felt fictional. The prosecution presented a clear, brutal theory. Alex murdered his wife and son to divert attention from his mounting financial scandals and to craft a new narrative of sympathy. They played Paul's final video, the one taken moments before the murders, and the jury heard Alex's voice at the kennels. That single clip, mundane, haunting, inescapable, undercut every claim he had made. The trial in early 2023 unfolded like a Southern pageant in reverse. The grandeur fell away, and what remained was stark. Jurors watched a timeline built from cell site pings, car telemetry, and the ordinary intimacy of Paul's video at the kennels, a few seconds that placed Alex at the scene when he had sworn he wasn't there. Technicians explained how a phone knows when it's picked up, how messages move, how a device can contradict the human holding it. The science was dry. The implication was not. Prosecutor Creighton Waters leaned on motive without theatrics, a man cornered by exposure, desperate to recast himself as a victim rather than a thief. He reminded jurors that crimes need not be impulsive to be intimate, and that the distance between financial collapse and violence is shorter than decent people like to imagine. The defense countered with the chaos of the crime scene, the possibility of alternate actors, the unreliability of memory under grief. They asked the jurors to look at Alex as a father, flawed, addicted, ashamed, but not a murderer. When Maggie's final movements appeared on a screen through her phone's metadata, the courtroom quieted. When the kennel video played, you could feel the collective breath shorten, the sound of dogs, human voices, a life continuing its ordinary rhythm right up until the moment it didn't. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The speed of their decision felt to some like moral certainty, to others like the gravity of a community finally snapping back into place after years of deference. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence, 2 consecutive life terms. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On March 2nd, 2023, Alex Murdaugh was found guilty on all counts, 2 murders and 2 weapons charges. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. Alex stood silent as the verdict was read, his face drained of the confidence that had once defined him. The dynasty that had ruled Hampton County for a century was over, not with a scandal hidden behind closed doors, but with a televised confession of ruin. Yet, even as the courtroom emptied, whispers lingered. Had the jury been swayed by emotion, by media pressure, by the sheer spectacle of a fallen empire? The prosecution declared victory. The defense promised to fight on. And somewhere deep in the South Carolina pines, the Moselle property, now empty, its kennels silent, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter. By the time Alex Murdaugh entered prison, the story of his downfall had already become a national obsession. But in the American South, a story rarely ends where the verdict is read. It simply shifts venues from the courtroom to the court of public opinion. And that is exactly what happened in 2024, when Alex's defense team announced their next move: an appeal. They claimed that members of the jury had been improperly influenced. According to sworn affidavits, a Colleton County court clerk had allegedly advised jurors not to trust Alex's testimony and hinted that convicting him would make them famous. The defense called it jury tampering, a violation serious enough to overturn even the most public conviction. Prosecutors dismissed it as a desperate reach for attention. Yet the claim forced the South Carolina Supreme Court to review the case, and once again, the name Murdaugh returned to headlines. In legal filings, the defense argued that Alex never received a fair trial, that the frenzy surrounding his family's reputation made objectivity impossible. They pointed to hundreds of news stories, viral clips, and podcasts dissecting his every move before the jury even stepped into the courtroom. How, one motion asked, can 12 citizens ignore the noise when the whole world is screaming guilty? By early 2025, the state's highest court agreed to hear limited arguments on whether jury misconduct may have affected the verdict. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Alex Murdaugh, the man who had confessed to financial crimes, staged his own shooting and lost everything, might be granted a second trial. The thought ignited outrage across South Carolina. For victims' families, it was another wound. For Alex's defenders, it was a sliver of hope that maybe the system he once controlled was still capable of mercy. At the same time, Netflix released The Murdaugh Murders: The Fall of a Dynasty, The Appeal. The documentary reconstructed every scene of the trial and its aftermath, blending courtroom footage with interviews and drone shots of the abandoned Moselle property. True crime culture has always walked a narrow ridge between illumination and consumption, and the Murdaugh saga turned that ridge into a highway. After the Netflix release, podcasts recorded multi-part dissections of the jury tampering claims. YouTube creators diagrammed timelines and monetized outrage. Comment sections split into familiar camps. The system is rigged versus the rich play by different rules. In Hampton County, the same courthouse where generations of Murdaughs once presided became a backdrop for selfies. Waitresses learned to spot out-of-towners debating ballistics over breakfast. Legal scholars warn that appeals are not retrials, that misconduct must reach a high bar to overturn a verdict, that public anger cuts both ways. It can pressure judges as easily as it once pressured jurors. Yet the noise was the point. The defense needed daylight, the state needed closure, and the culture, primed by streaming platforms and algorithmic recommendation, needed another episode. In that churn, the line between a fair reckoning and a public ritual blurred, leaving the court to answer a question the crowd could not. Where does justice end and spectacle begin? Within days of its release, search trends for Murdaugh Appeal 2025 spiked worldwide. Viewers who had never heard of Hampton County were suddenly debating legal ethics and media bias. The line between justice and entertainment blurred once more. For the people who actually lived in that small corner of South Carolina, the attention was exhausting. Tourists drove through town taking selfies near the courthouse. Podcasters recorded episodes from diner booths. Hampton's quiet streets became a symbol of the South's uneasy relationship with its own myths, wealth, power, respectability, and what happens when those illusions collapse. Inside his cell, Alex Murdaugh continued to claim innocence in the murders, even as he admitted to nearly every other crime. His lawyers spoke of faith, redemption, and the long road to truth. Outside, the world argued about whether a man born into privilege could ever truly be judged by the same standard as everyone else. As 2025 drew to a close, no final decision had been announced. The Supreme Court was still deliberating, and the public waited. Was this a last attempt by a guilty man to rewrite his fate, or a legitimate test of whether justice in America could remain impartial under the weight of spectacle? The South Carolina heat lingered, thick and unrelenting, over courthouses and pine fields alike, and somewhere behind concrete walls, Alex Murdaugh waited for an answer. The courthouse in Walterboro is quiet now. The cameras are gone, the crowds dispersed, and the banners that once screamed justice have faded under the Carolina sun. Yet, inside those brick walls, the air still carries the echo of a name, Murdaugh. It drifts through empty hallways like a ghost of the South's old order, a reminder of how power, when left unchecked, can corrode from within. The Moselle property stands abandoned, its fields overgrown, and the kennels sealed. Locals say you can still hear the dogs barking at night, though the pens have been empty for years. The family portraits are gone, sold at auction along with the furniture, but faint outlines remain on the wallpaper, silhouettes of a dynasty erased. To many in Hampton County, Moselle isn't just a crime scene. It's a monument to a truth they had long refused to see, that privilege and justice rarely share the same table. For decades, the Murdaughs had written the rules here. They built schools, funded campaigns, and handed down verdicts that shaped lives. Their downfall has left a vacuum, not only in the courts, but in the collective identity of a town that once relied on their shadow. Some still defend the family name, insisting Alex was framed or driven to madness by loss. Others see the verdict as a reckoning a century in the making. Either way, the story has become larger than one man or one trial. It is a mirror held up to the South itself. The appeal remains unresolved, the truth, or what's left of it, still suspended in legal limbo. But even if the courts were to reverse the verdict tomorrow, the moral outcome is already decided. A family that once embodied the law has come to symbolize everything that can go wrong when power becomes heritage. The dynasty ended not with dignity, but with deceit, its legacy rewritten by the very justice system it once commanded. And yet, amid the ruins of reputation and memory, the question lingers. Was Alex Murdaugh a monster shaped by greed, or a product of the very world that made him untouchable for so long? In the end, perhaps both can be true. As the sun sets over the Lowcountry marshes, the wind moves through the reeds, slow, deliberate, almost mournful. It carries no verdict, no certainty, only a whisper that justice in this place comes at a price. Sometimes the mightiest names fall not because of what they hide, but because of what they believe they can get away with. In the months after the verdict, the markers of a dynasty's collapse were practical as well as poetic. Moselle was sold, its proceeds routed through a lattice of liens, creditors, and court-approved distributions that sent money, finally, toward victims who had waited years. The old firm changed signage and structure, the way institutions do when they survive scandal by shedding a skin. In church foyers and grocery aisles, people stopped speaking in certainties and started speaking in sighs. It's over. It's not over. It will never be over. Some residents still lower their voices when they say the name Murdaugh, as if invoking it might call back the era when the family's reach set the town's horizon. Others say it plainly, as evidence that the Lowcountry's deference is not destiny. The courts will decide the appeal, time will decide the legacy. But the county has already moved in small, measurable ways. New faces in civic roles, new scrutiny for old practices, a new understanding that reputations are not resumes. If there's progress here, it is incremental and unphotogenic. A clerk double-checking a disbursement, a partner asking a harder question, a juror insisting on silence before a vote. The story that began as a family tragedy ended as a civics lesson written in headlines and ledgers. If the South is haunted, as its writers say, it is not only by ghosts of the past, but by the systems it builds and the stories it tells about them. The wind still moves through the reeds at dusk. The courthouse doors still open at 9. And somewhere, a ledger is balanced, not because it makes for good television, but because it has to. The dynasty is gone, but its shadows still linger in the Lowcountry mist. In every courtroom, in every secret, the echoes remain. Every secret waits to be revealed. Every silence that carries an echo, every story is waiting to be told. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth.